So let's get started. So if we think about the narrative that's dominated the TV market over the last few years, much of the focus has been centered around subscription streaming services. First Netflix, then Amazon, and much more recently, services like Apple TV Plus and all of the studio-backed products. But of course, in Europe, as many of us will be well aware, we're used to an array of local products run by broadcasters that fill an incredibly important part of the market. So these BVOD services, and it's not a neat bucket of products, it's not defined by business model, most of them are free to view, some of them are ad-funded, some of them have subscription models, but these broadcaster-led products are all united by the fact that they're run by local, public or commercial sector broadcasting groups. And they're incredibly important from a consumption perspective. It's often easy to forget when we're thinking of the news that we're reading that's often coming out of the US about the rise of subscription services, the performance of AVOD products, that in Europe we have this category of services that isn't really replicated elsewhere in the world. And they're widely used. If we think about the Western European market landscape and what consumers engage with on a regular basis, BVOD services are used quite widely. So this chart is simply looking at the proportion of internet users across major Western European markets that used one or more subscription video on demand services in the last month, one or more broadcaster-led video on demand services in the last month. So that might be services like iPlayer or MyTF1 in France or ZDF MediaTek in Germany. And AVOD services in grey. And BVOD services use about half of internet users on a monthly basis, so very important to the landscape. And of course, I'm delivering this session from the UK, and the UK is arguably the home, the most important market from a BVOD perspective, the most developed market. And in the UK, BVOD services and subscription video on demand services are broadly neck and neck in terms of the number of monthly users they attract. So nearly 2/3 of UK internet users are engaging with one of the broadcaster-led video on demand services on a monthly basis. So hugely important from a consumption perspective. They're also hugely important from the perspective of funding and perspective of driving the future of broadcasters in Europe. Let's take a look at one of the revenue streams that underpins the broadcast market in Europe, advertising. So this chart here is simply looking at the annual ad revenue, the annual net advertising revenue generated from linear TV, linear broadcast TV, by the biggest broadcasters in the largest 5 Western European markets. And it's not a particularly exciting picture. If we look at the trend on this chart, we can see it's at best flat. And if you're really honest, it's on a downward trajectory. So back in 2016, the market was for these broadcasters, worth about $15.5 billion. By the end of 2022, after a pretty torrid period caused by the pandemic, that market will have declined to about $15.2 billion. So from that perspective, broadcasters in Europe are facing a fairly lackluster future. But when you layer in the advertising revenue generated by BVOD products, you get a subtle but important difference, and that market is tipped from marginal decline into moderate growth. It's not particularly stellar when we can compare to subscription video on demand services, of course, but nonetheless, this is a mature market, so any growth, particularly to the degrees that we're seeing in this chart, is pretty good. But the market, of course, is getting increasingly crowded. And if I put up a slightly psychedelic slide, this is designed to illustrate primarily the level and the number of competitors that broadcasters face in Europe. So basically, each one of these little dots represents a video on demand service in Western Europe. And the chart is illustrating where they're all positioned. So you can broadly think of this as, on the horizontal axis, how new the catalogues are, so new. On the vertical axis, how good those catalogues are. They're well reviewed by consumers, so better. And the size of the bubble indicates the size of the catalogue. So newer, better, bigger. Now, there are many, many things on this chart, so I just wanted to draw your attention specifically to the services in orange, so some of the broadcast-led video-on-demand products. And one of the key things that I was asked to look at for this presentation is, what are the strategies that broadcasters can use or are using to consistently engage and drive growth and engage certain demographic groups? And the answer looking at this chart is that, well, there are actually relatively few commonalities between strategies in the market. Some services have lots of new content. Some services are focused on providing large catalogues of older content. Some services are slightly better, some are worse, some are bigger, some are smaller. So what actually determines success in the market? So let's have a look at some of the most successful services. Now, success can be measured in a variety of different ways, but for the sake of argument and to try and compare across a whole range of different products, let's just assume we mean monthly reach, so monthly users of different products. So this chart is illustrating, again, percentage of internet users across a selection of Western European markets, and how many of those in the home territories of each broadcaster use that service. So ranging from iPlayer, which is reaching about 60% of internet users in the UK, to Wiley in Finland, Rai in Italy, DLTV Denmark, and so on and so forth. So what drives some services to perform well, some services to perform less well? Well, there are a variety of factors, as you might imagine. One of those is quite simple, the volume of content that is being provided. So this scatter plot here, each one of the little dots again represents a video on demand service. Horizontal axis illustrates the number of titles in the catalogues, and the vertical axis is what I was showing you on the previous slide, so the percentage of people who'd used that product in the prior month. And there's a fairly clear, imperfect, but a clear correlation between the size of the catalogue, so the amount of content that's in the library, and the number of people who are using that service on a regular basis. And of course, that's not rocket science. The more stuff you put in your catalogue, the more likely it is that someone's going to find something of interest to watch in there. But of course, there's a law of diminishing returns here, that if you've got 5,000 titles in your catalogue and you add another 1,000, that's going to have a less of an impact for you than if you've got 500 titles in your catalogue and you add another 1,000. But broadly speaking, there's a relationship. But of course, it's not the only thing determining success. It's not just about the sheer volume of content. You can see over on the left-hand side of the chart there's a few services that are outperforming despite having relatively small catalogues. And that could be a variety of reasons. Some of these might have newer catalogues, they might have better quality, or they might simply be refreshing the catalogues a lot faster. So if we're taking a snapshot in time, actually that catalogue may have changed a few weeks later because there's a whole load of new stuff coming through. Of course, there are other things that influence success. You can have all the content in the world, but if you're not telling people about it, who's going to watch it? And for those of you who were here yesterday for the Samsung presentation, and I apologise for the fairly poor quality of the screenshot I've taken of my home Samsung TV here. For those of you who were here yesterday for the Samsung presentation, there was a lot of discussion about prominence and the importance of making sure that your service is visible and accessible on the main streaming devices that people are using. So I've just taken a quick screenshot of my home Samsung TV. Do not ask me what LOL network is. I have no idea. But what I've illustrated at the bottom here is in the app bar, where some of the broadcaster-led services are finding themselves. And this is a far cry from what we'd expect to see in the linear world, where you've got BBC One, BBC Two, ITV, Channel 4, 5, etc. And in fact, the broadcaster services are scattered amongst a plethora of other free and subscription products. And in fact, if we look at poor old My5 on the right-hand side, position number 15, I'm going to have to press the button 15 times to get over to My5 and watch something. And that, of course, is going to be a deterrent to anyone wanting to watch one of the broadcaster-led video-on-demand services. So inevitably, some success is going to be governed by where you're positioned on key devices. But it's not just about this. We also need to think about what's driving people specifically to go to the VOD services over the linear channels or other properties that broadcasters own. And this is where I think broadcasters over the next few years in Europe are going to have to start making some hard choices. The chart here illustrates the commissioning activity across major Western European broadcasters and where those commissions are destined. Are they heading for the linear channels or are they heading for the VOD services? And it's fair to say that over the last couple of years, VOD services have not been the priority for most Western European broadcasters. In fact, about 10% of commissions are destined, or first-run commissions are destined for video on demand, about 90% for linear. And if we take into account renewals, that number is even more extreme. And that's a far cry from what we've seen in the US, where we've seen a significant pivot in strategy from studio groups over the last few years. That same metric, so the share of first-run commissions for US groups, has shifted from, if we look over there on 2019, for some of the groups, about 6, 8, 12%, so where the European broadcasters are now, up to 30, 40, 50% of their output is destined for video on demand. And that's what's driving people towards these services now. So broadcasters are going to have to really think about where they're creating programming for, which audiences are they targeting, and are there hard choices they need to make about the audiences of tomorrow. Now, lastly, you may be looking at this as a European broadcaster and thinking, well, that's fine, Richard, yeah, but I can't compete with a Netflix on a global footing to secure a primary position on their interface for my app. on a Samsung Smart TV or an LG TV, I can't dedicate all my programming budget to video on demand. I've got a broadcast network to run. So there may be alternative options, because all the while you're thinking, well, this market's getting increasingly crowded, exactly the same is happening to US groups, that the market is looking very crowded for them. Their domestic market is saturated, and they're looking at a future internationally where, unless they can drive growth, shareholders are going to start looking at them a little askance. So we've started to see the emergence of a number of new strategies from US groups targeted at accelerating their global expansion. And some of these have been partnering with European broadcast groups. So Joyn in Germany is a good example with Discovery, but also more recently, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, Viafree, run by Viaplay Group, and Pluto from Paramount Group have joined forces in Scandinavia. Viafree is going to be folded into Pluto TV. There'll be a whole load of local content that's available on Pluto TV. Viafree will handle ad sales, and in theory it should be a win-win situation: more content, new platform, local ad sales, higher ad loads, more money. So with that, let me sum up. Now, there are a few, I think, what I've characterized as easy wins. Now, I'm conscious I don't have to implement this, so it's easy for me to say that it's straightforward. But first up would be to avoid fragmentation. We've seen how many services there are in the market, and there are still broadcasters out there that run multiple video-on-demand services, each targeting different business model, different type of content, whatever it is. Trying to avoid that fragmentation in a very complex market will be crucial to longer-term success. It also helps with the second point now, which is a focus on improving the catalogue scale. We've seen that catalogue scale is hugely important for the performance of video-on-demand services. So if you can, A, avoid fragmentation, and B, use a lot of your back catalogue to grow your catalogue, that's going to be to your advantage. Cross-promotion, incredibly important. Don't forget about it. Broadcast channels still have huge reach, so make sure you're constantly telling people about the services. And then there are a few strategic choices, some harder decisions that broadcasters are going to need to make. So if we think about prominence, first up. Now, it's pretty clear that most local broadcasters are not going to be able to compete for prominence on many of the big international devices. So they may have to consider policy solutions, and we know that across Europe, broadcasters are talking to policymakers about the concept of prominence and making sure that that is carried over from the linear world into the streaming world. But in the short term, because the gears of government, of course, grind pretty slowly, they may need to consider other solutions, so buying ad space, making sure the apps are promoted. So if you can't afford to get your app from position 15 up to position 5, maybe there are other ways that you can advertise your product. Secondly, adjusting the commissioning strategy, making video-on-demand services less of a secondary consideration, less of an afterthought for consumers, and making them much more of a focal point. And that may necessitate some hard choices about where content investments go, or some upfront risky investments around the video-on-demand products. And lastly, if all of that is looking pretty tough, there may well be some big US groups who are looking at the market equally puzzled by how they develop their strategy going forward, and they may well be open to conversations about how you create partnerships for mutual benefit. So with that, I'm going to finish up. I hope that was useful. Back to Jonathan.